Welcome to Margin of Thought, where we make space for the questions that matter. I'm your host, Priten, and together we'll explore questions that help us preserve what matters while navigating what's coming. Some of the most important questions in higher ed are very old ones. How do students learn to read carefully, think clearly, and disagree well? Today's guest is Paul Blaschko, a teaching professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, where he teaches courses on God, the good life, and philosophy as a way of life. His work sits at the intersection of liberal education, critical thinking, and course design, with a particular focus on helping students engage in big questions with more clarity and confidence. We also discuss what philosophy can offer higher education in a moment shaped by AI, polarization, and uncertainty about what learning is for. Let's begin.
So my name is Paul Blaschko, and I am an assistant teaching professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. I also direct a program for students that are studying business and liberal arts. It's called the Sheedy Family Program in Economy, Enterprise, and Society, which is a mouthful. We call it the Sheedy Program. But here at Notre Dame, my central sort of work is introducing students to big questions in the context of philosophy. So both with the Sheedy program, I'm teaching first and second philosophy courses that ask students to reflect on big picture questions at the intersection of the liberal arts and business. So questions about justice, society, that sort of thing. And then a huge part of my job is to teach a course at Notre Dame called God and the Good Life, which is a first philosophy course. Most of our freshmen actually take it. It fulfills one of the requirements that they have to take at Notre Dame. And it's a question that introduces them not to the discipline of philosophy, but to philosophy as a tradition, kind of as a way of life, an older sort of tradition. So we're asking big questions: meaning in life, religion, God, suffering. And every week we're taking on these new questions and, looking to historical texts, really important thinkers, to work our way through those.
Oh, very cool. Okay, so we have lots of things that we should talk about. Before we get into it, I like to ask folks what their own memory of using an EdTech tool is as a student, the earliest one you have, or the most prominent one, even if you have one.
Yeah, so my answer to this, I hope I'm not avoiding the question, but my answer to this is actually YouTube. And here's how I would explain it. When I was in college, I was obviously a bit of a nerd. I think it's important for professors to remember that we are atypical students. We're kind of weird, but I was really, really motivated to learn more about the things that we were talking about in class. And so I remember, doing the readings, I would frequently pull up a YouTube kind of explainer video or tutorial to just really get me in the headspace, kind of help me get some of the context in the background. And then after class, I would often seek out lectures that were given by professors. I think I'm, one of the few that probably would watch through like a 120-minute or an hour and 20-minute lecture. But also, there were even then a number of people who were focused topically, thematically, like here's philosophy, let's relate this to any number of concerns that we care about. I do remember in college, we certainly had like a learning management system. And I'll say I've always been very kind of an early adopter with technology and educational technology. And on the one hand, like, I will explore any functionality that I'm given. And it's like, okay, this is what it's meant to do. But at the same time, I'm always thinking about, from the perspective of somebody who's less motivated to get to the actual content or the functionality, what's the most effective way to reach those people? What's the most effective way to kind of structure it? So for me, the internet has been just a huge sort of educational technology and tool. And then over the years, there's any number of particular tools that I've focused in on. But I would say, yeah, as a student, I'm going to go with YouTube.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm curious more about this YouTube idea. You said you were nerdy, and so I'm going to assume that you did the reading either before or after the video. And I want to hear about that process a little bit.
So this is one of the things that I talk to colleagues the most about, especially when I'm, consulting with somebody on designing like a large lecture philosophy course. It took me a little bit, but I'd say fairly early in my teaching career, I realized most students aren't doing readings. Like most students We're kind of lucky if they're like reading Spark Notes, I guess is what it was when I was in college. Now it's just like plugging it into ChatGPT. It's really kind of a high bar, right? Asking them to read, 5, 10 pages. If it's dense academic text, I mean, gosh, like 2, 3, 4, 5 pages. And so that's something that I've kind of gone back into my experience and then tried to reverse engineer using EdTech tools sometimes. But to get to your question, how did I sort of process information as I was walking through a class? Well, the first thing that I would do is I'd look at the syllabus, I'd look at what we're reading, and I would just try to find the thing that I already knew about that was closest to whatever it was. So, I'm in an ancient philosophy course, and I think like, oh yeah, no, I saw this YouTube video on virtue ethics and Aristotle. And okay, let's start there. And I just try to get a picture, just context. For me, it was really about exploring. And I think here's where the nerdiness or intrinsic curiosity comes in. I don't expect my students, and I don't think we should expect our students to have that motivation with respect to every single thing that they're studying, especially if it's a general requirement. And certainly there were things, chemistry or something, where I was like, I just need to get through this, help me. But with respect to philosophy or literature, a lot of the humanities courses I was taking, I'd really try to get that background, just the context, because I found without that, and I found this really early on, I just didn't get anything out of the readings. And I think that's probably a reason why many of our students don't do the readings. They feel like it's a waste of time. And I think in some cases it is. It's just if you don't understand some of the basic assumptions or historical context, whatever it is, if you don't have some schema, but if you don't have a schema, if you don't have a way of relating to the sort of conceptual framework of the text, it's just like running your eyes over words. I could do that as a discipline, I suppose. Once I was kind of in that context, I would read for philosophy, I would read sort of intensely and I would actually take notes. I don't know why, but like I developed this weird system where I had to have all of the notes of a particular text on a single page. And so I started writing teeny tiny sort of structures and I wanted to be able to grasp the thing as a whole. Like what is it that's really being claimed or illustrated, whatever it is? What is that? Because once I got in class, even if I had the context, read the content, and kind of understood it as I went, I'd get to class and they'd be like, all right, here's a big question. And I'd be like, I just don't know how to locate myself here, right? Like I need a map. And so that's what I would do. I would just take these really tiny notes and kind of put them together, understand the different chunks. If it was a big book, okay, a page per chapter, whatever. And for me, that was such an enlightening experience. And the benefits just compounded. Like I would go into a class and I could spend 5 hours prepping the class, just reading the text or whatever. If I spent 7 hours kind of messing around and understanding it and trying it out in different ways, I'd come in and I'd be like, oh, I get this. Like it's like walking into a room where you're studying a foreign language and people are speaking that language, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait a second. Like I totally get this. I see where they're going with it. So for me, that's what my prep would look like as a student. And I would just spend days in the library. I would just like, just sit there and kind of do all of this work.
It's interesting because I don't think I've heard anybody else explicitly describe this process. And now I'm thinking like, even as a like this kind of thing for me also started like as an elementary school student. I remember every time we started a new unit, my mom would take me to Barnes and Nobles and I would grab every book on the topic we were about to learn. And I would read all of it. It'd be like, if you lived during the blah 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 times and like whatever, right? Like there were all these children's series, especially for history. And then I'd get to class and I would have a much more entertaining time because there was almost this like I knew the plot a little bit. And so I think that helped kind of just enjoy the class instead of like be like, oh, I have to like focus on everything. I think as a philosophy student, it was podcasts. I used to do like podcasts with other folks discussing the same readings before I did the readings. And then oftentimes after, I'd be like, oh, this random author came up, but I don't have the time to go read like more stuff written by somebody else, but I'm still curious about like how that's contextualized. But what strikes me is that you and I were both intrinsically motivated to do that. It was not externally enforced. I also didn't do it in the classes where like it wasn't exactly my top interest. I'm curious now, you teach a gen ed course, you teach it on a topic that some students might not see a direct relation right away. And so how do you try to get your students to do the reading in your class? And if so, what does that look like?
Oh yeah, definitely. I would say there's different strategies that I have depending on the size of the class and the level at which it's taught. Although most classes that I teach are first or second philosophy courses. So I'll describe the strategy that I use for God and the Good Life first. So, like I said, it's a big first philosophy course. We call it first philosophy rather than intro. I don't know, it's fancy. And we organize it around these four big questions. So there's four units that correspond to these questions. How should you live your life? Well, what is it to live the good life? What is the good life? So an ethics unit. How do you figure out what to believe? So there's so many sources of information. There's so much disagreement out there. How do you sort through that? What are effective belief forming mechanisms? I'd call it the epistemology unit, although I think I used that word twice in the course the whole semester. And then the third unit's about religion. So should you practice a religion? And then the fourth unit is about meaning in life. And that's kind of a summative unit where we're like, all right, let's take a step back and look at some of these different pictures. So one reason why we teach the course that way is because when I was initially TAing for big intro classes, the kind of default setting is an introduction to the discipline of philosophy. And for somebody like me, who, even as an undergrad, second, third year undergrad, I was like, oh, I might want to go into this. I want to be a professor or something. But for 99.8% of our students, I'd say there's not even really an awareness of what an academic discipline is. They're coming in as freshmen. They're very smart. They're incredibly smart. But the sort of way we organize higher education is very different than the way that we organize K-12. And so they don't really know what that discipline is. And even when they do, or if you explain to them, that's not an intrinsically motivating sort of story or map for them. So when we were designing God and the Good Life, what we did is really take a step back and think about what our students were already motivated to think about. And my colleague and I, Megan Sullivan, with whom I designed God and the Good Life, we saw that philosophy showed up in our lives in all kinds of ways that we were absolutely sure it was showing up in our students' lives too. But in the wild, it looks very different than it does in the classroom, right? So, I'd read a New York Times op-ed and I'd be like, man, this is utilitarianism. Like, this is just effective altruism. This is crazy. Like, yeah, whatever. And I'd send it to Megan and she'd be like, oh, yeah. So for us, philosophy is relevant kind of day-to-day basis as we're working through things. We're in conversations with people. I mean, college students love having big conversations, deep conversations, thinking about stuff. They've got a lot of time. I mean, they're very busy, but so we knew these are issues and questions that are already part of students' mental scheme. They're already thinking about this stuff. So how do we kind of meet them halfway and say, hey, look, here's a way that philosophers within a particular tradition have articulated and asked that question. Maybe you find yourself spinning your wheels when you think about religion. Like, what do I do? I don't know. Like, how do I even decide? Like, what is the criteria? Like, am I having fun? What is so like, if you think about that in kind of a structured way, you might be able to make some progress there. I would say the biggest challenge is in the first couple of weeks, just inviting them into that conversation, showing them that you've done enough research. You kind of know not exactly who they are, but you know roughly where they're at. You've designed the course and the questions with them in mind, and then going through a few cycles of that to gain their trust that, like, yeah, okay, if I do the readings, and for us, the readings, honestly, we have readings, primary texts that we've excerpted, so selected down, and then we get experts to actually write annotations for the readings. It used to be just me, but now we've actually got philosophy professors across the country going through a peer-reviewed process where they produce these digital essays that we collect in this philosophy library. And so we have the students going in there, and the thought there is like, if you start reading Aristotle and you get lost in paragraph 2, it can just feel like you're all alone. And it's like, either I force myself to look through this or whatever. Whereas if you've got somebody, and this is where tech comes in, it's so great. If you've got somebody that's kind of right there and says like, okay, I know this sounds crazy, right? Like, what is he talking about? Like, we can't just skip over that. Like, what is that, right? And then offer them kind of the next step, which often for me is these short form videos. I'm kind of, in a way, reconstructing the process that I would go through, right? And saying, yeah, you might want to click on this video here and you can explanation. Then, I noticed in the first couple of weeks, our students open up a little bit more and they think like, okay, sort of trust the process. Now, there are a lot of barriers still at play, the biggest of which I think is grades, to be honest with you. a lot of students, especially at a really high achieving institution like Notre Dame, I imagine everywhere, but especially here, there's really like a deep fear. There's almost like a compliance mindset that they come in with. It's like, how do I check all the boxes? And then once I've done that, I could, over and above that, kind of learn some things that I'm interested in. But first and foremost, it's like, what exactly are you expecting? Let me perform this exactly how you expect it. I need to get the perfect GPA, the whatever. And so there are various things that we then have to work through with respect to that, right? So you start building this trust, but then you still have this kind of thought in the background. They're like, okay, but like, are you going to trick me and then give me this test? So there's any number of things that you've got to do with that. But for me, it's starting with the student kind of designing the course around their goals, what they're already interested in, what they care about, and then demonstrating, showing them, kind of allowing them to enact the way in which the material can actually help them with things that they care about, like figure out, yeah, does God exist? Like suffering, like is that a decisive objection? And then just continuing to build that trust throughout the semester. So that's how I approach it in the big lecture. I would say our readings are probably shorter, but I really expect the students to do them. We hold them accountable through daily reading quizzes and that sort of thing. But really, what I'm hoping is that you do those first couple, and you're like, this feels different, right? This like trigger the kind of reaction that I might otherwise have. I gotta get through this. And then we can kind of build up a culture of trust and sort of inquiry together. So that's how we do it in the big lecture course. I could talk about how I do it in smaller seminars, but maybe that's like a good place to start.
Okay, so this was not on purpose, but the name of the podcast is Margin of Thought because I found myself, there was a middle school teacher who made me read a book called like How to Read. And at that point, I was a nerdy little middle schooler and I was like, how to read? Like, I know how to read. Like, why are you assigning this to me? And that started a practice of annotating while I read for me. And that was like game changing in terms of how engaged I was with the text. And that is where I feel like the real thinking happens is when you're kind of able to be engaged in the margins and put your own little notes and see other folks' notes. I think like shared annotations is another like a great pedagogical tool. But I love the idea of experts having already like provided some annotations in the margins for you to engage with the text and kind of like hold your hand a little bit. So that's great. I want to hear about, I want to focus on the big course partially because I think that the smaller seminar courses are probably a little bit more self-selecting. And I think there's a larger challenge of like getting students to be motivated enough to do readings, especially in a gen ed course. I agree that grades are probably a huge chunk of this. I'm a proponent of pass fail of gen ed. If I can get one thing changed in higher ed, that would be it. I think students would take a lot more risks with exploring disciplines if they like didn't have to pick the easiest gen ed in each category where they're like, oh, this professor always gets an A, and so I'm going to take this gen ed rather than the thing that they're actually interested in. But that's a separate conversation. I want to hear a little bit about some of the strategies you've mentioned seem already AI proof to me, right? The student buy-in is obviously not reliant upon this draconian enforcement mechanism. That suddenly becomes impossible with AI tools. Obviously, in-class reading quizzes is another easy AI proof way to make sure that students are engaging in the reading. Have you noticed a difference, or has it made a perceptible difference in the classroom post AI in terms of how much of the reading you think the students are doing? And has that changed how you think about it?
Yeah, I haven't noticed as big of a shift as I thought I might. In part because the digital essays that we're assigning to the students, they exist on their own webpage. They're pretty highly formatted and structured. They've got drop down menus and okay, you can click this and that, whatever. So it's not really easy to like copy paste. And I'm not just giving them like a PDF or something. And so I'm not sure, if that's like a deterrent or something like that. But I think even before AI came around, to me, whether the students are reading was a huge problem. It was a huge question. Um, and one that was really hard to sort of get information about, right? Students are incredibly good at performing learning, right? They're really good. It's really tough. I think like if you had a blind test and you had two students, one that did the reading, one that didn't do the reading, maybe they spent like 10 minutes or something kind of Googling or something. I think it's really hard to know, right? Like in class in a setting like that, whether they're doing it or not. So my default assumption has always been that we've got to build some trust in order for the students to be investing the time that would make reading and engaging really worth it for them. Some of that is a concession, and people critique this sometimes when I talk about this, especially at philosophy conferences. Some of it's a concession to the way that the attention economy exists online. Some of it is a recognition that when students are doing reading for your class, the laptop's open, the phone's here, there's so much information coming in all the time. Maybe 15, 20, 30, 50 years ago, maybe I could have been like, all right, here's the book, here's the chapter. What else are you going to do? I've never kind of come in with that assumption that my students owe me that attention. I don't know if that's the kind of best attitude to have. But I would say for that reason, I haven't felt as thrown off by AI, especially when it comes to the reading part of it. Because for a long time, my question has been like, well, how is this reading aligned with the goals that I've got for them? And if they're not doing the reading, it could very well be a failure on my part as an educator to set the expectations or explain or whatever. But it's also an indication that, well, they didn't really need to do that reading. That's weird. Is there something in the design of the course that I could change so that I'm motivating them, maybe extrinsically, but hopefully intrinsically, to actually do that thing? And so I'm often going back and forth between those things. And I don't have firm and settled views that, well, this is the only way. It's got to be like a paper copy of a PDF that like, I really, at this point in my career, I really enjoy the kind of back and forth and the ongoing development and innovation. And I find with AI, actually, it's becoming increasingly possible to try out experiments like the digital essay format. The first time we put this together, that was me with a WordPress site. I'm not a coder by any means, but I'm playing with these margins. Got the technology office here to train me and some Adobe product to create web pages. Okay, that took a lot of time and effort. I was very motivated to do it. Now it's like, man, we could actually put this together fairly quickly. You can try that out. And if students respond well to it, oh, that's awesome. Like, let's kind of lean in that direction. So I guess, yeah, with respect to reading, I just haven't felt it as much. I don't doubt that it's changed the way that students engage with the texts that we're reading for class, but I haven't felt it as much in the room.
Yeah. I've heard both extremes of like we have to figure out any way possible to get them to do the reading because the reading is good for like reading's sake and building attention and discernment. And then I've also heard from folks who are saying it's over. Like it's not like we have to just like move on. Like if that's not what students are doing, it's not. There is probably a reason why it's not necessary anymore, and maybe like they're still consuming a lot of content, just like not long form content. Lots of interesting takes on it. I think I like the middle ground of it. Like if I see some importance in it, let me see how I can structure my course to get them to do it. And if I'm struggling to do that, maybe that particular piece is not necessary of reading. Also, the short pieces help. I think that's one of the things I've noticed with students now is getting them to like read any like, and then this is K to 12 education too is all excerpt based, right? Like no one assigns folks to assign books on a large scale. We have assigned less books in the last decade than we did before. I want to talk about how our paths crossed. And so we get to work together through Thinker Analytics, and that's an EdTech tool. So I'm curious about what motivated you to try it and what has kept you with us in terms of using it in your classroom.
So, over the history of God and the Good Life, we've tried many different experiments with learning goals and especially capstone projects. Like what we wanted students to get out of the course has looked different. There's some things that kind of remain the same and essential, but has looked very different from the beginning of the course. So, right at the beginning, our overarching project that students would work on throughout the semester, turn in at the end, was what we called the apology assignment. And apology as in like an explanation in defense of your beliefs, like Socrates' apology or Newman's apology. So, we use that as kind of a hook at the beginning. Look, you're in this class, you're going to be able to write sort of an apologia. Where is it that you're at right now? Kind of a snapshot. It's sort of a philosophical story of how you're approaching the world and how you got there. And I love that assignment. And the students loved it in many ways. But the difficult thing that we identified almost right away in the semester is that there was so much intrinsic motivation to do the assignment. And then they would turn it in and we look at it and be like, okay, they're not like arguing as well as we'd like in here. But grading it on a traditional model of like, great, you get 70%, it really deflated them. It kind of betrayed the trust in a way. They're like, look, I just put my heart out there. And you're like, yeah, you're like 70% good at believing things. Like what? There was this weird kind of back and forth. So we tried various experiments to get them to critically think and sort of argue and engage. And a lot of them failed miserably. So the first thing I did is I created my own informal reasoning system. I wrote a 50-page textbook and we assigned it to them. I created a game and there were rules and all this kind of stuff. was great because I learned how hard it is to teach informal reasoning and logic. We did try actually right before that, we tried having like a mini logic unit. It's like 3 days, like a week and a half, where we're like validity, soundness, premises. And then we'd present premised arguments throughout the semester. But again, like just students were not picking up on that. And they were like, it takes a long, long time to really get those skills sort of set deeply enough for it to, be applicable in what they're writing. So I had come across this idea of mastery-based learning, just I don't know even exactly when or where, but this idea that, practice over these sets of problems that can be very, very extensive. This is the way that you develop those kind of habits of mind and skill. And, that was about the same time where I was like, I can't write thousands and millions of practice sets and questions. Well, luckily, there's somebody that's already done that, right? So the Thinker Analytics course, Think Arguments, really takes students step by step. And it is a trade-off because the students are not coming out having learned like symbolic logic or like formal logic in any sense. And that's a trade-off. On the other hand, like my experience, I couldn't really teach them that unless I devoted half or more of the semester to that itself. And what we found was the quality of the students' writing and their interactions in class, kind of critiquing, analyzing, evaluating an argument, just shot way up. Like it was just way better. And it was so obvious to me and the TAs and the teaching team that we were like, oh, we got to integrate this into the course and adopt it. At the same time, the students actually weren't seeing the growth as much as we wanted. And so they would come into class and I started surveying them. And I'm like, how good are you at critical thinking? And they'd be like, oh, yeah. I was like, 90% of the questions on this test, I'm definitely going to get right. And then I'd have them take a pretest and it was like 40%. And they were like, whoa, like, right? Like they're coming in and they're sort of learning what they don't know. And then by the end of the course, I'd administer a post test. And now I give them like a little report. And it's like, it's got this beautiful little line. It's like, that's what you learned how to do. It's also nice because the pre-post test that I use is based on the LSAT. And so like that's a pretty intrinsically motivated to be able to be good at something that they know is like a skill that is desired, even if they're not going to law school. That again just kind of connects up with certain motivations that they've got. So we started doing Thinker Analytics 3 or 4 years ago and have just gradually integrated it more and more into the fabric of the course. And eventually, with some of this research, I formalized it a bit more. And then with Aiden in Thinker Analytics, we've written up a paper that it's coming out this coming summer. But for me, yeah, that's just like, that's the kind of problem that I was trying to solve for is like, how do we get these students who are now willing to be vulnerable and say like, yeah, like, suffering is a huge problem. It makes me question whether God exists. How do we get them to the next step where they can really articulate that in a space where you can go back and forth, but not in like a kind of anxious, kind of, I don't know, sort of challenging, identity challenging way, right? I don't want to say to somebody like, oh, that's a dumb reason for believing in God or not. But if I can say, well, wait a second, like, do you really think that this claim is supporting this or whatever? It gives you that kind of distance to activate whatever part of your brain it is that's like, oh, we're on the same team here. We can be on the same team here. And this can kind of be a collaborative project to improve my thinking on this. So it's provided so many things for the class. I'm so glad we've done it. And I just love all the experiments that we've been able to run with it.
Um, so we have two projects that we're working with you on now, both very exciting. The first, I think, is an experiment on both our ends with the integration of like an AI metacognitive coach. And I want to hear from you what problem you think that was solving to experiment. Like, what are you hoping it solves in your classroom, given that you've already had a pretty good experience seeing some results from the baseline course?
So the way that I often think about EdTech is if there's a problem that I'm already encountering, and then there's some tool that could sort of meet that need, right? I'd sometimes experiment and just say like, oh, this sounds like a cool function. Let's plug that in and see what's going on. More often though, we're hitting some wall, hitting some obstacle. And I try to zoom out and think, is there some digital tool or is there some structure even in the course that we could use it to address this? The problem that led to this project with the AI tutor is that students who walked through Think Arguments in the way that it was sequenced and designed and who had enough kind of reasoning ability at the beginning, you hit a sort of snag. Of course, you've got these mastery checks, right? Where you've got to get 90% on the mastery check for every given lesson. Maybe they're not passing them all on the first try. They can pretty quickly see with the feedback that they're getting in that mastery check. Oh, you've got to go to this thing, So a lot of our students are able to do that and kind of do it on their own. But there was a significant chunk, like, 20% maybe, who just got really frustrated. And sometimes it was because they weren't going slow enough. We all know the experience of doing an online course, whether it's compliance for your job or whatever, where you're just click through, and it can kind of feel like that for some of the students. Sometimes it was, something further. It was just like there was some basic kind of wire that was getting crossed. The best experiences I had were when students would come in and talk to me, and I'd say, let's do the mastery check together. Like, let's just walk through this together. We'd say, like, okay, is it A, B, C, or D? C is whatever. And then as they made sort of a mistake, they would articulate it. I'd say, well, wait a second. Let's think about this, one more time. That's not the answer that I came to. Maybe you're right, but okay. And just have this like quick conversation. And what I found was like students who had struggled for 2 hours with a mastery check and had tried to go back and everything else, just within a matter of 5 or 10 minutes, we're just like, oh, that makes sense. I get it. Now, there's a huge bottleneck problem. There's a huge kind of feedback loop problem where if you've got a student who is struggling with a mastery check on lesson 2, and you're not going to see them again for, a week, and then if they're going to sign up for office hours, we try to be as available as we can. There's a vast number of students who will just not go through the process, or by the time they get into the meeting, it's like, I kind of lost the progress and the momentum. And so my thought was, if we had like a 1-800 number that they could call every time they were stuck, and we could just be like, okay, let's walk through it together. Well, it seems like this is a function. It's something I use AI for all the time. I'm stuck and I need to get unstuck. And I don't necessarily need like a brand new idea or some creative. I just need to talk it out. And I could do that with a friend who might not even be in the class and just be like, here's what I'm thinking. I'm stuck in the whatever. But AI just seems particularly well designed, or at least like in my kind of amateur understanding of it, especially with a kind of closed system where there are distinct rules and there are moves, and you can keep those in mind, seem really well suited to be the kind of thing that could provide that sort of intervention. And if students found it useful, I think it has the potential of just being integrated into the kind of learning strategy that they use throughout the course. What's the thought? Can we solve the kind of bottleneck problem with student getting feedback? Can we create a feedback loop that is near instantaneous, that's very quick, and that helps them get unstuck, so that, when we get to the interventions and the assessments that require human interactions and, grading and kind of giving feedback, doing workshops, we're freed up to do that. And students, aren't kind of burning with this frustration or question that they had 2 weeks ago. And now we've kind of lost the momentum with them. So that was the initial thought.
Yeah. I get a chance to teach a Think Arguments course to adult learners at a community college. And what I had also noticed was completion rates were very, very low unless I explicitly made time in class to go through, like, on the screen, let's do this. What is everybody like? Why are you getting this wrong? What are we thinking about? I have not yet taught it since the tutor came out. I'm very excited to do so because that was, the scalability of that was impossible. Like, if students were not in class, like, they were still behind. If, like, we only got a chance to cover 3 out of the 6 modules that we wanted them to complete, we didn't get a chance to get them that individual metacognitive support. I found ways to in class be like, okay, everybody, write something down first, then we'll talk about it, just to make sure that even the folks who weren't raising their hand and engaging were doing some of that metacognitive work. But yeah, that is what I'm hoping we continue to see with the tool. But, we're still in the early days and we'll keep working on it to get it there. I want to finish by talking about a new project we're getting to work on. So tell me a little bit about what sparked that interest and what you're excited about, because I know we're in the super early stages of that still.
So with Thinker Analytics, with you guys, with Gary Comstock at NC State, with a bunch of different partners across the country, we've recently been awarded about $4 million to study whether it's possible to scale critical thinking instruction with Think Arguments, and then also training in dialogue with people that you would disagree with and sort of, civil discourse, whether it's possible to scale that not just in a class. I feel confident, like in my own teaching, I'm like, all right, we can do this, like for 150 students, we can do this. But can you scale that in a way that would actually have potentially an impact kind of nationwide, right? What would that look like? I've done a couple of projects like that in the past. The Mellon Foundation, when I was just graduating with my PhD here at Notre Dame, I was a postdoc on this project called the Philosophy as a Way of Life project, where we brought hundreds of instructors from across the country together to design, redesign, and share information about how they were structuring courses like God and the Good Life, like the ones that I was teaching here. So, what I found from that was an incredible amount of energy and an incredible amount of information sharing. I think our discipline, the discipline of philosophy, maybe academic disciplines in general, we've got really great venues for sharing ideas about research, communicating about research. But teaching, which is often maybe the majority or like at least like half of what we're doing, there are fewer venues. Like there are fewer kind of common ways of thinking or talking. And my wife, who's a K-12 teacher and has taught various different institutions and structures over the years, I noticed and I got really jealous. Like they've kind of got that, right? Like they've got professional development, they've got a certain kind of operating system pedagogically. So here, the thought was we've got think arguments. We've got this other tool that was new to me when I started thinking about this project with Gary and others called Sway, which is an AI coach that helps you engage in structured disagreement with somebody and kind of coaches you and helps you along the way. So we've got these two tools. Instructors on the team have had great success with both of these things, and they are self-contained in a way, but at the same time, if you integrate them into your course intentionally, at least in our experience, the results are just exponentially different. So when I first started doing think arguments, I was like, all right, great. Everybody go sign up for an account, do it, come back. Okay. I saw progress. I saw like, I was like, this is cool. I can kind of discern in the writing of some of these students. But when I stepped back and I thought, okay, we're actually going to pull this up in class. We're going to go through this. I'm going to create maps of the arguments that we're talking about in class. We're going to have check-ins and assignments related to it. That's when I saw this really incredible, substantial growth. That's when I started measuring it. I hadn't measured before, but I guarantee you this was like more growth. And so it seems like we just have this really unique opportunity where, you know, what does the world need more of? Critical thinking. And not just in general, not just like, oh yeah, we could get, but like very, very, very specifically, like critical thinking about, issues that matter to us and that we've got to talk about in order to have a healthy, functioning democracy, among many other things. It seemed to me, I just saw this kind of vision where it's like, we can do this with a network of faculty, like a very big network of faculty, and sort of iterate, study it, kind of improve it in ways that I really do think tangibly, like could impact higher ed, hopefully on like a scale that I've never worked on before, I guess is what I'm saying there. So the idea is, yeah, we'll bring faculty together over 3 summers. So this year is a planning summer. And then over 3 summers, we're going to bring these faculty fellows together. We're going to help them design and integrate these tools. We're going to help them with the course design aspect of integrating these tools into their classes. And then we're going to run a bunch of experiments and see, okay, what's working, what isn't? How do we get really good at doing this? What's the process? Can we create resources and tools that will then kind of live on and allow even more people to access these things? Um, so yeah, I'm super excited about it. It's been like long been one of my favorite parts of teaching philosophy. It's been excellent just to see students come into class really afraid to engage with other people at all, and to leave class by the end, having conversations that maybe they're not the most politically contentious or risky conversations, but they're way riskier than any of the sort of thing that they were willing to do on day one. They can say like, well, here's where I'm coming from, and I know that you totally disagree with this. Like, let's build on that in some way. And so having concrete tools that can help educators do that more in higher ed, it's just a really exciting prospect.
Um, Before we talk about big picture hopes and ambitions, I want to hear about how you're thinking about funding from a polarized source to solve polarized thinking in the country. Because obviously the Department of Education and the Trump administration are a polarized topic across the country. And so, yeah, what was the thinking behind seeking funding from them?
Yeah. So the grant is funded through the Department of Education. And like you mentioned, the process for this round of funding, I guess in some ways, is very normal. Like, as always, there are priorities that are set by the Department of Education, whatever administration is currently in power. They're announced, they're sent out, you kind of apply. In this case, there was sort of a truncated version of that. It happened more quickly than it had in the past. And to be honest, in applying for the project, none of that really entered my mind. Gary and I and Aiden and others, I'm sure you were part of these conversations for the past 4 or 5 months, which I'll come back to in a second. We've been thinking, okay, let's put something together that looks like this. We're really confident in the research that we've done. We see this possibility to extend it. We had just started the process, and I've gone through this with many different grant processes, most of which failed. You start putting together ideas on paper, and you're like, okay, and here, all of a sudden, this one pops up, and it's like Department of Education, this opportunity. And I think because of the mix of people, the team that we had who are plugged into civil discourse institutes across the country, people who have been working on the critical thinking aspect, because of that team, we saw that call and we're like, this is perfect. This is great. Now, my thought was like, yeah, okay, great. This is a great first deadline to get us to really put something together that we can then kind of like cut up and change and everything else. The crazy thing for me is that we hit it on the first go around. Crazy in one sense, because that just like rarely happens. In another sense, though, having a team as varied and expert as the one that we're working with on this, to me, I was amazed by how well this proposal came together and the depth that it had, right? There was so much experience in running these kind of large scale pedagogical experiments, assessing and actually measuring these things that as we went through, instead of kind of discovering, oh gosh, there's a huge element that like maybe we need somebody else to come on board and do this, the pieces really just sort of fit together. So that was a really unique experience for me in terms of grant writing and seeking funding. And like I said, maybe this is something that's true of me more generally. I tend to think that we think too much about politics at the national level. And I tend to think that we tend to consider things that we see in the news to be decision relevant that often really aren't decision relevant. And so for me, certainly not unaware of like what's going on structurally and everything else. But for me, the question didn't arise in the sense that here's a normal process. Like this is what it looks like. It's a little bit shorter. Clearly, they were trying to hit the fiscal year deadline or something like that. Again, those are things that happen in politics all the time. It's like this is approved. Here's the thing, whatever. And so I looked at that, and had there been some strangeness, had there been somebody who was like anonymous email, it's like, we want this person to apply, I'd be like, you guys, what's going on here? But for me, it was in many ways a very ordinary process coming together, putting the proposal together that we really wanted to put together. There was no thought in putting the proposal together. Well, let's, if we kind of like bend this part of it or do that thing. It was just all the normal kind of here's the criteria, this is what we want to do. And even more so for me than in the past, I think grant writing, you can sometimes get tempted to be like, oh, we can sell this as that. And you can, and sometimes you win that like a small grant or something. And then you're like, well, wait a second, do I really want to do that? For me, a huge part of the integrity of the grant as you go through is just looking at each piece of it and being like, is this stuff that I want to do, that I believe in? And the more it fits the criteria for the grant, that's great. It has come up. People have been curious about it. People have asked me about that. And it was an odd thing to then come to Notre Dame and just to say to Notre Dame Research and others on campus, like, oh yeah, we got a Department of Ed grant, which Notre Dame doesn't get a ton of those. And so it's like, yeah, it's a very particular time. Like, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of things going on. But I think in my case, in the case of the research team, this looks like the sort of grant writing, funding, building process that I would want to see in any sort of big project that gets funded.
And just to be clear, on an ongoing basis, the content, the pedagogical tools, how you frame issues, is any of that going to be influenced by who's in the administration, especially given that this will outlive the current administration?
I think Gary, Simon Cullen, who's on the project, others have been experimenting for years with how to deal with polarization through disagreement and arguments in class. And so for me, that's something that has long been on the table. Like, how do we do that? How do we figure that out? I talk to colleagues all the time about this. There's a fear of even approaching political topics in classes, and maybe justified by just all kinds of crazy dynamics that have happened in higher ed. So I've long wanted to find a way of turning the temperature down in the room, creating conditions where we can have these dialogues and disagreements in classes. I don't think that's like a safe activity in the sense that like it's not risk free. Like you're always taking a risk when you do that and when you train students to do that. But in my own life, I found it to be so helpful. Like part of the whole process of my higher education, graduate school, but really especially in college, was this kind of classic like liberating of the mind, kind of this liberal arts ideal where it was like, oh, I can think about things that I vehemently disagree with and not feel like, okay, my identity is being thrown into the ring here. I'm personally being attacked. And there's better and worse ways to do that. So training students, giving them those tools is a huge part of the project. But in my teaching experience, and certainly the experience of the folks who are on the team here, that's long been true. It's just that these tools in this particular format give us a really effective, in our experience, way of doing it.
I'm curious now, like we've talked about everything from having students think about the role of religion and whether or not they have good arguments for believing in God, all the way up to very contemporary political discourse. And you span a pretty wide spectrum of interest, but also relevance to a student's life. When you think about the future of higher ed, especially with all the attacks and also questions about what it looks like in a world of AI and the access to both teaching and information getting increased, but also jobs looking different. What do you think your role will be in 10 years as a professor?
I think it will look really different. I'm really glad that institutions exist that are very stable and that have like very sort of deep communities of practice and sort of see what they're doing as a craft and that sort of thing. I'm also very aware that, the world changes and maybe it's just like recency bias, but it seems like it's changing faster than in previous. Like for the most part, I'm very optimistic about it. I think in my own teaching, part of that optimism comes from a real focus on um, what I think is really valuable or important about what we're doing. Like I really truly believe with all my heart that if you read texts carefully, if you think about questions that you have on an everyday basis that others have thought about throughout history, if you do that, like you are forming yourself, you're sort of shaping who you are as a person in a way that is like just deep, fundamentally important work to do. I haven't seen any indication in my teaching that students don't feel the same way. I see a lot of distractions and barriers and obstacles, some of which are coming from the outside, social media or phone use or whatever, some of which are coming from the inside, sort of rigid way about how we define what kind of thought is valuable or what counts as research or whatever. So there's always obstacles like that. But I consistently find in my real relationships with students and certainly the intentional community that we try to build in the class in this program that I run, I consistently find that there's an appetite and a motivation for that exact thing, that kind of process of formation. As we've gone through different shifts and changes, and now we've got the era of the LMS or the era of the online class, now we've got the AI, whatever. In each of those settings so far, I have found tools that help us do that more effectively as a community. That's obviously not to say that there aren't downsides of some of the tools and some of the technology, et cetera. But I guess that's just what I hold on to. It's like, okay, like, year after year, semester after semester, sometimes it's a lot more work than others because I've got to adapt this whole thing. We're switching LMS. AI came out, whatever. Sometimes it's a lot more work. But for me, like that's the work that I do. Like that's what I want to do. And I just expect it to look very different. It's like parenting. I have 5 kids, and every time you think like, oh, great, we've nailed this, now we know exactly how to deal with it. They change, right? It's like they're radically different. And so I don't know, by having that kind of anchor in the relationship and the trust that I have with my students, and then just seeing those results kind of semester to semester, I don't know. I'm excited. And I think it will look different for better and for worse. But I guess my hope is like, as long as I'm still in a position where I'm able to teach, I'm able to have these conversations and dialogues with students, like I'll feel incredibly lucky.
Wow, that it is nice to hear an optimistic take on higher ed right now. And so I appreciate that. And I hope the listeners also get to leave with a little bit of optimism and hope that it will be different but still worthwhile. So that was helpful. Thank you.
I love it. Yeah, no problem. This is so fun. I love doing this. This is great. I can do it all day, anytime.
Perfect. Bye.
See you in the future.
Yep, take care. Thank you to Paul for joining us. What I appreciated about this conversation is that beneath the discussion of AI and education technology was a more basic question. What does it take to help students read closely, think clearly, and stay in conversation when disagreements get hard? Paul's work offers a hopeful answer. Students are still capable of serious thought and meaningful growth, but getting there takes intentional course design and trust. Keep listening as we continue exploring the ethics of education technology. And for more, check out my book, Ethical EdTech, at ethicaledtech.org. Thanks for listening to Margin of Thought. If this episode gave you something to think about, subscribe, rate, and review us. Also, share it with someone who might be asking similar questions. You can find the show notes, transcripts, and my newsletter at preten.org. Until next time, keep making space for the questions that matter.